It started with something as petty as a parking notice, a bright yellow slip taped firmly on the windshield of my father's car, right outside our own home. The words printed in bold letters read, "Unauthorized vehicle, subject to towing." It was absurd. This was our driveway, our house, but that little slip of paper carried a tone that was more than just bureaucratic enforcement. It was personal. My father, Mr. Kamau, a quiet and reserved man with a razor-sharp mind and the patience of a saint, didn't react the way most would have. He didn't curse or storm down to the HOA office. He calmly peeled the notice off, folded it precisely, and slid it into his pocket like a bookmark. That night, he sat at dinner sipping his chamomile tea in complete silence. He didn't bring up the notice, but my mother caught his gaze. It was sharp, intense, but measured. She knew something had changed. The following morning, 2 more cars in our driveway were adorned with the same glaring notice. These cars belonged to my cousins, who had stayed over during the weekend. We had always had guests over. Our driveway, comfortably fit for vehicles without any of them touching the street. There had never been an issue before. Suddenly, our family gathering had become an HOA violation. My younger brother, only 12 at the time, looked up and asked, "Baba, are we not allowed to park at our own house anymore?" My father simply responded, "It seems we are being told that." By the end of that week, a formal complaint from the Homeowners Association arrived in our mailbox. It was printed on crisp letterhead, full of legal language and polite threats. They claimed our excessive vehicle presence was a disruption to the neighborhood's aesthetic and a violation of community guidelines. They demanded immediate compliance, and threatened to escalate the issue further if we did not comply. It felt surreal. We had lived in that neighborhood for over 10 years without a single complaint. Suddenly, the people who once waved at us on morning walks were filing anonymous grievances. My mother suspected jealousy. Our house was one of the largest on the block, but we had never flaunted it. My father, however, saw something deeper, and he didn't panic. He prepared. What the HOA didn't know was that my father was the vice president of regional credit risk at one of the largest financial institutions in the country. His job was understanding risk, investigating financial structures, and assessing credibility. The very people who were now targeting us were, unknowingly, tied to the economic web my father had helped build and monitor. Some of them ran local businesses. Others had large mortgages or multiple property loans. And almost all of them were vulnerable to financial scrutiny. Instead of reacting emotionally, my father began to gather information. He started attending every HOA meeting, sitting quietly in the back, always listening. He never spoke, never protested. He observed, he took notes. When the HOA president bragged about expanding her boutique firm into new commercial spaces, he wrote it down. When another board member talked about refinancing his third property, my father marked the date. Within a few weeks, we began receiving fines, $100 for the first week, then $200. The letters became more aggressive. They threatened legal action. One morning, we saw a towing truck parked on our street with its engine idling, clearly waiting. My father stepped outside in his slippers unbothered. He approached the driver, greeted him politely, and stood in front of the cars. The driver hesitated, made a phone call, and minutes later, turned the ignition off and left. Nothing was towed. That day. What followed wasn't a battle of shouting matches or petty retaliation. My father waged a war of intelligence, precision, and leverage. He returned to his study every night, spending hours reviewing financial records, public filings, business registries, and credit reports. He never said a word about what he found. But we began to notice changes. Within a month, projects tied. 2 certain board members began stalling. One of them was developing a new office building downtown. Suddenly, the construction loan was denied. Another was trying to refinance an investment property. The deal fell through inexplicably. A third found himself under an unexpected financial audit. Whispers floated around the neighborhood. No one connected the events to my father, but we knew. Then came the day he brought home a binder. He placed it on the dining table with a quiet thud. On the front, it bore the name of the HOA president's business. Inside, there were detailed reports, publicly available, but difficult to compile without experience. It included financial liabilities, partnerships, and the extensive lines of credit that supported her operations. Many of those credit lines were linked to banks or partners connected to my father's network. He had not tampered with anything. He didn't need to. He simply flagged the risks, noted the inconsistencies, and let the systems work as they were designed. 3 weeks later, the HOA sent a formal letter to our home. It was dressed in polite language and said the previous complaints had been reevaluated and all fines would be waived as a gesture of goodwill. It was an apology without admitting guilt. But it was enough. Our driveway remained ours. Cars came and went, as they always had. We never received another warning or fine. No more threats, no more notices. My father stopped attending the meetings. He had made his point, but people in the neighborhood started treating us differently, not with fear, but with a quiet respect. Some even began waving again. My father never gloated. He never bragged. He resumed his peaceful routine: morning walks, weekend gardening, evening tea with classical music playing in the background. But everyone knew that Mr. Kama was not to be pushed. He had shown them the kind of power that doesn't roar. It observes, calculates, and when the moment is right, strikes with precision. He hadn't just defended our family, he had exposed the fragility of those who tried to dominate us. And, in doing so, he had shifted the entire balance of power in the neighborhood without raising his voice once. Now, the board is more cautious in its dealings. Policies are implemented more fairly. In our family, we live in peace. All because my father turned a parking notice into a lesson in quiet strength. The calm after the storm didn't last long. A few weeks after the HOA had quietly dropped the fines and threats, a new election for the HOA board was announced. Flyers were taped to neighborhood mailboxes and stapled to trees, with a bright and cheerful slogan, "A new vision for Harmony Court." It sounded innocent enough, but we could tell there was tension beneath the surface. My mother noticed the names on the ballot. Some were familiar. A couple were the same board members who had pushed for the parking restrictions and fines, but a few others were new people we hadn't heard much from before. Curious, my father attended the next open HOA meeting. He listened as the board presented their goals for the next term: neighborhood beautification, improved safety, and better community engagement. All the usual buzzwords. But then, tucked inside their agenda, was a new proposal: restrictions on overnight guests and driveway usage. My father raised an eyebrow. He wasn't surprised. The tactic was the same, only more subtle. Instead of targeting individual households, they were trying to write broader policies that would still restrict families like ours. That night at dinner, my father announced something unexpected. "I'm running for the board," he said. We were stunned. He had always avoided the spotlight, but his eyes were steady. "If they want to write the rules," he said, "then I'll make sure they're written fairly." Over the next few weeks, our home transformed into a quiet campaign center. My mother helped design simple flyers with no flashy slogans, just honest bullet points: transparency, respect, equality. My older sister helped organize small meet and greets, where neighbors came over for tea and cookies, while my father calmly explained his platform. He didn't promise big changes, he just promised fairness. He promised to listen. Word spread. People remembered how calmly he had handled the parking situation. They respected how he hadn't lashed out or escalated things. Slowly, support grew. One by one, even those who had remained silent during our struggle came forward, offering to help distribute flyers or make quiet introductions to other residents. Election day arrived with an unusual buzz in the air. People actually showed up. Usually, HOA elections had barely 20% participation. This time, it felt like the entire block came out. Neighbors chatted at the polling station, some openly praising my father. Others stayed quiet but nodded in respect. When the results were announced later that evening, my father had not only won, he had received the highest number of votes in HOA history. The mood at home was light that night. Not celebratory, just content. My father didn't see this as a victory, just a responsibility. He attended the next board meeting in a simple blazer, carrying a thin notebook. He listened more than he spoke, and when the new driveway restriction proposal came up, he calmly presented alternative data, including surveys he had personally conducted across the neighborhood. The proposal was voted down. Respectfully, quietly, over time, small changes began to appear. Monthly financial reports were posted transparently online. Meeting minutes were emailed to all residents. Community events were planned inclusively, not just by the same inner circle. The HOA stopped feeling like a closed club and started functioning like it was supposed to: a group of neighbors working together. But not everyone was happy. The former HOA president, the one whose financial profile my father had quietly dismantled, still lived a few houses down. She never spoke to us directly, but her glances carried heat. One day, a rumor surfaced that she was considering a lawsuit against the HOA for defamation and interference with her business, but nothing ever came of it. Most likely, she knew any investigation would only expose her further. Meanwhile, my father had begun mentoring to younger board members. One of them was a first-time homeowner, nervous but eager to learn. The other was a single mother who had always avoided HOA meetings, fearing she wouldn't be heard. My father encouraged them both, told them their voices mattered. Slowly, the board became more representative, and the neighborhood changed too. There were more children playing in driveways, more diverse families joining events, more neighbors waving hello instead of pretending not to see each other. My father never took credit. He said he was just doing his duty. But we knew. We all knew. One Saturday morning, as we were tending to our front garden, a man we had never spoken to before approached. He looked uncomfortable, shifting on his feet. He finally said, "I just wanted to say thank you. A few years ago, I got a warning for having my elderly father stay over too long. It made me feel unwelcome. But things feel different now. I appreciate that." My father nodded, shook his hand, and replied, We all deserve to feel at home in our own neighborhood. That simple sentence became a kind of philosophy for him. Whether it was HOA meetings, neighborhood picnics, or small disputes over fence lines, he always returned to that idea. Everyone deserves to feel at home. As for our driveway, it's still busy. My cousins visit, friends drop by, cars come and go. But there are no more warnings, no more yellow slips, just the quiet hum of everyday life, unfolding the way it should. And every so often, I see my father sitting on the porch, watching the neighborhood, not with suspicion or wariness, but with quiet pride, not because he won some battle but because he helped change the rules of engagement. He reminded everyone that power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it simply parks in its own driveway and waits. The next phase of our neighborhood journey began slowly, almost imperceptibly. While my father had managed to transform the tone of the HOA and shift the way our community operated, there were still lingering tensions that hadn't fully dissolved. And in communities like ours, sometimes resentment takes root in the smallest cracks. It began with anonymous complaints. Someone claimed that our backyard fence was a few inches too high. Another report accused us of installing outdoor lights that were too bright at night. Then came the noise complaints unfounded, vague, and always arriving after weekends when our extended family gathered for dinner. My father wasn't surprised. Progress, he said, invites scrutiny. But he didn't let it shake him. Instead, he addressed each complaint with the same calm demeanor. He invited HOA inspectors to visit our property and verify the facts themselves. Every time, the result was the same: no violation. Still, the pattern was clear. Someone was trying to wear him down. But my father didn't flinch. He doubled down on his work with the HOA, initiating new programs that focused on transparency. In fairness, he helped establish a neighborhood resource center for homeowners to better understand HOA policies and their rights. He made sure that no family new or old would feel isolated or targeted the way we once had. Then, something unexpected happened. A new family moved into the neighborhood. The Nendicos. They were warm, friendly, and had 3 young children. Within weeks, they were welcomed by most of the neighbors except by a few of the former board members, who seemed to treat them with suspicion. When the Nendicos hosted a small birthday party for their son and parked a few extra cars in their driveway, they received an official warning letter the very next day. My father saw this as a test. Would the HOA slip back into old habits? Or had it truly changed? He called an emergency meeting, not to confront or accuse, but to ask questions. Who had authorized the warning? Was it consistent with current policy? Had there been similar warnings issued to other homes in the last 6 months? The answers were revealing. The warning had been pushed through without a full board vote. It violated new policies about guest parking, and no other families had been cited for similar situations. The board retracted the warning and issued an apology. The Nendicos were grateful, but wary. My father sat with them, shared our own story, and reassured them they were welcome here, that this neighborhood would not return to its old, exclusive ways. In the following months, the board introduced a rotation system for leadership roles, ensuring fresh voices and fair representation. My father stepped back from his position, but remained an advisor. He believed in succession, in training others to lead with integrity. Meanwhile, those who had once wielded power unfairly began to fade into the background. Some sold their homes, others simply stopped attending meetings. The neighborhood had changed, and it no longer catered to silent hierarchies. One evening, as we sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the rooftops, my father turned to me and said, "You know, it was never about park." Not really. It was about how easily people abuse small bits of authority, and how powerful it can be when someone chooses to stand firm, quietly, respectfully, but without backing down. He paused, then smiled. Most people think power is about how loud you are, but real power is in how you respond when someone tries to push you out of your own space. I nodded. I had watched it all unfold. I had seen how one quiet man had changed an entire community, not with outrage, but with reason. Not with revenge, but with resolve. The HOA meetings became more civil. More people attended, eager to participate. Neighborhood events grew in size. And diversity, people no longer felt like guests in their own homes. And new families like the Nendicos felt safe from the moment they arrived. One weekend, the HOA organized a community fair. Food stalls, games for kids, music, and a panel of neighborhood storytellers. They asked my father to speak. He declined, at first, but after some convincing, he stood on the small stage, looked out over the crowd, and simply said, "A neighborhood isn't made up of fences or parking rules. It's made of people, people who look out for each other, who listen, who care. I'm proud to live among you, and I hope we all remember this place belongs to all of us." The applause was long and genuine, not because he had given a rousing speech, but because he had lived his words. The very people who had once plotted to silence his voice were now sitting in the crowd, listening quietly, and perhaps, for the first time, understanding what leadership really looked like. The weeks following the community fair settled into a comfortable rhythm. The energy in the neighborhood had shifted. People were friendlier, more involved. Yards looked better, cared for. Porches saw more conversation. And for the first time, in years, Harmony Court lived up to its name. But behind this peaceful transformation, a quiet legacy was unfolding. My father, now stepping back from the HOA leadership, spent more of his time walking the neighborhood, often stopping to talk with neighbors. He wasn't campaigning anymore, he was just being present. And people respected that. They approached him not as a leader, but as a neighbor they trusted. He gave advice when asked, helped settle minor disputes, and shared stories from his youth that always seemed to hold a lesson in them. One afternoon, a young couple knocked on our door. They were moving into one of the newly sold homes and wanted to ask my father how they could get involved with the HOA. They had heard about the changes from the real estate agent and said the openness of the board was one of the reasons they chose this neighborhood. My father smiled and invited them in. Over a cup of tea, he explained the history, not just the wins, but the struggles. He wanted them to understand that good governance required effort and vigilance. They left with a notebook full of resources and his quiet encouragement to speak up when needed. Around this time, I noticed my father started compiling a binder. It had no labels, just loose notes, meeting agendas, and handwritten letters. When I asked about it, he said, "I want to leave something behind, not for recognition, but so the next person doesn't have to start from scratch." The binder eventually turned into a guidebook for new HOA board members. He included everything: how to run fair meetings, how to deal with difficult neighbors without escalating conflict, how to ensure transparency in finances, and most importantly, how to lead with empathy. The board formally adopted the guidebook. 6 months later, it became required reading for all incoming members. As more new families moved into the community, the story of our driveway, the fines, and the bank shutdown became a sort of neighborhood legend. It wasn't told with bitterness, but as a reminder of how far the community had come. Children grew up hearing about Mr. A's stand for fairness, and even those who had once disagreed with him gradually came to appreciate his vision. One day, the local news reached out. They were doing a piece on neighborhood governance and had heard about the quiet revolution in Harmony Court. My father declined an interview, but recommended a few board members who had grown into their roles under his mentorship. The article ran with the headline, "The HOA that learned to listen." There was no mention of my father shutting down bank loans or silencing corrupt leaders. Just a story of a neighborhood transformed by compassion, transparency, and quiet courage. Time passed. Seasons changed. My father grew older. He spent more time on the porch, sometimes with a book, sometimes just watching the breeze rustle the trees. One evening, I sat beside him and asked if he had ever thought about moving to somewhere quieter, away from the politics and history. He looked at me and said, "I did think about it, once, but then I realized wherever you live, there will always be people trying to bend the rules for their benefit. What matters is whether anyone is willing to stand up and say, 'Not here, not this time.'" And in that moment, I understood something deeper. His legacy wasn't about changing the rules or winning votes. It was about showing others that standing firm, with dignity and respect, could change hearts more effectively than anger ever could. Eventually, a new HOA president took office, a former mentee of my father. The neighborhood continued to thrive. Families felt welcome. Disputes were handled with fairness, and the sense of community deepened. The driveway my father once defended now symbolized something greater. It wasn't just a strip of concrete, it was proof that you could reclaim your space, your voice, and your dignity, even when the odds were stacked against you. Visitors who came to Harmony Court would sometimes ask about the peaceful vibe, the tight-knit feel, and neighbors would smile, gesture toward our house, and say, "It started right there, with a driveway and a man who refused to be pushed aside." The story lives on not as a tale of revenge, but as a reminder that even the smallest actions, when done with purpose and principle, can ripple through an entire community. And so, the quiet revolution continues. One driveway, one neighbor, one act of integrity at a time.